Week, this time, continues to be the famine in Africa. The tragedy of men, women, and little children by the thousands dying of thirst, starvation, and disease. Clearly, the most disgusting sidebar story to this main event is the one of political murder, the continuing charge that with the silent acquiescence of the United Nations and others, the Ethiopian government is intentionally preventing food and other aid from reaching some of its people. They are the residents of the provinces of Eritrea and Tigray in northern Ethiopia near the Sudan. There have been civil wars going on in these areas for years, for some as many as 25 years. For some, the wars are for local autonomy from the Ethiopian government. For others, it's the overthrow of the Ethiopian government completely. It is this political part of the Ethiopian famine tragedy that we focus on first and foremost tonight. Representatives of the Ethiopian government and the United Nations are here, as is the head of the U.S. government's relief organization. But first, the charge is laid out in this documentary report by correspondent Terence McKenna of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for the CBC's The Journal program.
Anyone who believes that the Ethiopian government is in control of the whole country is in for a surprise when they visit the famine areas in the north. It is the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that calls the shots here. They're a coalition of opposition groups from Tigray province that banded together and launched a civil war 9 years ago. Although some of the leaders are said to be communist, they claim they're not fighting for any political dogma. They're fighting to save their Tigrinya language and culture. The rebels are well organized and well armed. The weapons in this field exercise all captured from the Ethiopian army. They are now allies with the rebels in the neighboring province of Eritrea, who've been fighting the government for 23 years. You have to look at a map of Ethiopia to understand how the political situation affects the famine areas in the north. The one major road from the capital of Addis Ababa through the northern provinces of Tigray and Eritrea is controlled by Ethiopian government troops. On that road at Korum and Mekelle are the refugee camps familiar from recent television newscasts. There are fewer than 200,000 people in the government camps along this road, but there are up to 4 million people at risk of starvation living in the rebel-held areas around the province of Tigray. The Ethiopian government seldom enters rebel territory, but they tell the world that they are delivering food everywhere in the country. This is the Ethiopian government camp of Korum, where 54,000 famine victims are receiving daily rations. The government, though, has a different approach to the millions of famine victims in the surrounding hills controlled by the guerrillas, where observers see a military solution being imposed.
I believe, especially after this trip and talking to the drought migrants, that the Ethiopian government intends to starve out a population that it has been unsuccessful in crushing militarily for the past almost 10 years.
The military authorities, essentially the junta, saw food shortage in Eritrea, Tigray, as a strategic weapon in their own hands. And they were quite prepared, as I suppose military authorities have been throughout history, quite prepared to use the enemy's shortage of supplies as a weapon.
The famine victims in rebel-held areas have been deprived of food and medicine for so long. When they finally reach help, it's often too late. These families have watched their loved ones die, killed not only by the intentional withholding of food, but killed by the active government campaigns against them.
We have eyewitness reports, Europeans as well as Ethiopians, who saw the army going from place to place and burning crops in a place where crops are very precious. And that cannot mean anything else as trying to starve the people.
The combination of the civil war and the drought has triggered a massive exodus of people from the rebel-held areas of northern Ethiopia toward the border with neighboring Sudan. especially to the area around the Sudanese town of Kassala. To hold back the approaching waves of humanity, the rebels are attempting to build their own relief operation. On the outskirts of Kassala, the Relief Society of Tigray is running a mill where wheat donated by the International Red Cross is ground into flour. The biggest problem is how to transport this food to those in need. The rebels have only 30...
United Nations, if it did that, a government, the present government, can say this is interference in my own internal affairs. Because they can always find a way of explaining that. And what would serve the United Nations? The United Nations cannot work if the government says, no, stop, you're not allowed to come in.
But surely, when people are starving, if the truth is that relief is not reaching most of the famine victims, that's more important than the diplomatic niceties of the way the United Nations works.
I entirely agree with you as an individual, but as coordinator, I must tell you that in each resolution which has been passed in the United Nations, there has been a paragraph saying the sovereignty of the country must be respected.
What price would the United Nations organizations pay by saying this is the situation, even if it is insulting to the government of Ethiopia?
It will not be able to intervene in the country at all.
You believe that the Ethiopian government would kick out the United Nations organizations?
I tell you that if I do it, Andrew will not be able to work there. That I am not believe, I'm certain.
10 years ago, the UN organizations made a solemn pledge that death by starvation would be eradicated from the planet by 1984. They failed. Until the UN can make an agreement that will eliminate the politics that withholds food from the starving, this scene will happen again and again.
To answer these charges, we have first Ethiopia's ambassador to the United Nations, Berhanu Dinka. Mr. Ambassador, how do you respond to the basic charge in that report that your government is deliberately withholding food from most of the famine victims because they live in the two rebel provinces?
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. My reaction to the film that we have just seen is one of indignation, because the whole story is based on hearsay and allegations made by 2 or 3 individuals, namely Dan Connell, Chris Carter, and Mr. Elliott of the British Independent Aid.
All representatives of different independent aid organizations.
Aid organizations who have no, who are not participating in any manner in the assistance that's being given to Ethiopia. They are not operating in Ethiopia. These people are working some in Britain and in Boston. In the case of Mr. Dan Connell and Chris Carter of Grassroots International, they are not operating in Ethiopia. They have not seen what's going on. They have not been there. And basically, the 3 of them are well known to European audiences, to us, to Ethiopians, and to our neighbors as people who have committed themselves for over a decade now to the cause of the rebellion movement in Ethiopia, in the northern region of Ethiopia.